Chapter 9. The Tyrannical Soul and the Conclusion of the Ideal City. Last of all comes the tyrannical man, about whom we have once more to ask, how is he formed out of the democratic? And how does he live, in happiness or in misery? Yes, he said, he is the only one remaining. There is, however, I said, a previous question which remains unanswered. What question? I do not think that we have adequately determined the nature and number of the desires, and until this is accomplished the inquiry will always be confused. Well, he said, it is not too late to supply the omission. Very true, I said, and observe the point which I want to understand. Certain of the unnecessary pleasures and desires I conceive to be unlawful, everyone appears to have them, but in some persons they are controlled by the laws and by reason, and the better desires prevail over them. Either they are wholly banished or they become few and weak, while in the case of others they are stronger, and there are more of them. Which desires do you mean? I mean those which are awake when the reasoning and human and ruling power is asleep. Then the wild beast within us, gorged with food or drink, starts up and having shaken off sleep, goes forth to satisfy his desires, and there is no conceivable folly or crime, not excepting incest or any other unnatural union, or murder of a family member, or the eating of forbidden food, which at such a time, when he has parted company with all shame and sense, a person may not be ready to commit. Most true, he said. But when a person's pulse is healthy and temperate, and when before going to sleep he has awakened his rational powers, and fed them on noble thoughts and inquiries, collecting himself in meditation, after having first indulged his desires neither too much nor too little, but just enough to lay them to sleep, and prevent them and their enjoyments and pains from interfering with the higher principle, which he leaves in the solitude of pure abstraction, free to contemplate and aspire to the knowledge of the unknown, whether in past, present, or future, when again he has allayed the passionate element, if he has a quarrel against any one, I say, when, after pacifying the two irrational principles, he rouses up the third, which is reason, before he takes his rest, then, as you know, he attains truth. Most nearly, and is least likely to be the sport of fantastic and lawless visions. I quite agree. In saying this I have been running into a digression, but the point which I desire to note is that in all of us, even in good individuals, there is a lawless wild beast nature, which peers out in sleep. Pray, consider whether I am right, and you agree with me. Yes, I agree. And now remember the character which we attributed to the democratic man. He was supposed from his youth upwards to have been trained under a stingy parent, who encouraged the saving desires in him, but discouraged the unnecessary, which aim only at amusement and ornament. True. And then he joined the company of more refined and immoral people, indulging in their sinful ways as a reaction to his father's meanness. Despite being a better person than his corruptors, he was pulled in both directions until he found a middle ground and led a life of moderate indulgence in various pleasures, not succumbing to vulgar and slavish passions. This is how the democrat was born out of the oligarch, right? Yes, that was our understanding, and it still holds true. Now, years have passed, and you must imagine this man, as he is, having a son who was raised with his father's principles. I can imagine that. Then you must also imagine the same thing happening to the son as it did to the father. He is drawn into a lawless life, which his seducers call perfect liberty, and his father and friends support his moderate desires, while the opposing party supports the opposite desires. When these wicked magicians and tyrant makers realize that they are losing their influence over him, they implant in him a dominant passion, a monstrous winged drone that rules over his idle and wasteful lusts. This is the only image that accurately describes him. Yes, that is the only adequate image of him. And when his other lusts, surrounded by incense, perfumes, garlands, wines, and all the pleasures of a dissolute life, come buzzing around him, nourishing the desire implanted in his drone-like nature, then the lord of his soul, with madness as the captain of his guard, goes into a frenzy. If he finds any good opinions or desires forming within him, and if there is any remaining sense of shame, he destroys them and casts them aside, purging away temperance and embracing madness completely. Yes, that is how the tyrannical man is created. And is this why love has been called a dictator in the past? I wouldn't be surprised. Furthermore, does not an intoxicated man also possess the spirit of a dictator? He does. And you know that a mentally unstable man, who is not sound in his mind, will believe that he can rule not only over men but also over the gods? That is true. And the true tyrannical man comes into existence when, due to nature, habit, or both, he becomes intoxicated, lustful, and passionate? Oh, my friend, is that not true? Certainly. This is the man, and this is his origin. And now, how does he live? Imagine, as people jokingly say, you were to tell me. I imagine, at the next stage of his progression, there will be parties, revelries, and prostitutes, and all that sort of thing. Love is the ruler of his inner self and controls all matters of his soul. That is certain. Yes, and every day and night, desires become numerous and formidable, demanding many things. They certainly do, he said. His income, if he has any, is quickly spent. True. Then comes debt and the depletion of his property. Of course. When he has nothing left, his desires, like young ravens in a nest, cry out for sustenance. And he, driven by them and especially by love himself, who leads them, becomes frenzied and eagerly seeks someone to deceive or rob of their property to satisfy them. Yes, that is bound to happen. He must have money, no matter how, if he is to escape dreadful pains and agony. He must. And just as the new pleasures overtake the old ones and take away their rights within him, he, being younger, will claim to have more than his father and mother. And if he has spent his own portion of the property, he will take a portion of theirs. No doubt he will. And if his parents refuse, he will first try to deceive and trick them. Very true. And if he fails, then he will use force and plunder them. Yes, probably. And if the old man and woman fight for what is rightfully theirs, what then, my friend? Will the individual feel any remorse for tyrannizing over them? No, he said, I would not feel at all comfortable about his parents. But, oh heavens! Adimantus, can you believe that due to some new love for a prostitute, who is anything but a necessary connection, he would strike his mother, who has been a long-time friend and is necessary to his very existence, and place her under the authority of the other woman when they are brought under the same roof? Or that, in similar circumstances, he would do the same to his withered old father, his first and most essential friend, for the sake of some newly discovered youthful person who is the opposite of essential? Yes, indeed, he said, I believe that he would. Truly, then, a tyrannical son is a blessing to his father and mother. He is, indeed, he replied. He first takes their property, and when that fails, and pleasures start to swarm in the hive of his soul, he breaks into a house or steals the clothes of a nighttime traveler. Next, he proceeds to rob a temple. Meanwhile, the old beliefs he had as a child, which made judgments about good and evil, are overthrown by the new beliefs that have just been freed and now serve as the bodyguards of love and share his dominion. In his democratic days, when he was still subject to the laws and his father, these desires were only let loose in his dreams during sleep. But now that he is under the rule of love, he constantly becomes in waking reality what he rarely was before, only in dreams. He will commit the foulest murder, or eat forbidden food, or be guilty of any other horrid act. Love is his dictator, and lives arrogantly in him and lawlessly, and being himself a king, leads him on, as a dictator leads a state, to the commission of any reckless deed by which he can maintain himself and the mob of his associates, whether those whom evil influences have brought in from outside, or those whom he himself has allowed to break loose within him due to a similar evil nature in himself. Do we not have here a depiction of his way of life? Yes, indeed, he said. And if there are only a few of them in the state, and the rest of the people are well disposed, they leave and become the bodyguards or hired soldiers of some other dictator who may probably want them for a war, and if there is no war, they stay at home and engage in many small acts of mischief in the city. What kind of mischief? For example, they are the thieves, burglars, pickpockets, muggers, robbers of temples, kidnappers of the community, or if they can speak, they become informants, and bear false witness, and accept bribes. A small list of evils, even if the perpetrators of them are few. Yes, I said, but small and great are relative terms, and all these things, in the misery and evil which they inflict upon a state, do not come within 1,000 miles of the dictator. When this harmful class and their followers grow numerous and become aware of their strength, assisted by the foolishness of the people, they choose from among themselves the one who has most of the dictator in his own soul, and him they create their dictator. Yes, he said, and he will be the most suitable to be a dictator. If the people yield, well and good, but if they resist him, as he began by beating his own father and mother, so now, if he has the power, he beats them, and will keep his dear old homeland, as the Cretans say, in subjection to his young followers whom he has introduced to be their rulers and masters. This is the end of his passions and desires. Exactly. When such men are only private individuals and before they get power, this is their character. They associate entirely with their own flatterers or ready tools, or if they want anything from anybody, they in their turn are equally ready to bow down before them. They profess every sort of affection for them, but when they have gained their point, they know them no more. Yes, truly. They are always either the masters or servants, and never the friends of anybody. The dictator never tastes of true freedom or friendship. Certainly not. And may we not rightly call such men treacherous? No question. Also, they are utterly unjust if we were right in our notion of justice? Yes, he said, and we were perfectly right. Let us then sum up in a word, I said, the character of the worst man. He is the waking reality of what we dreamed. Most true. And this is he who being by nature most of a dictator bears rule, and the longer he lives the more of a dictator he becomes. That is certain, said Glaucon, taking his turn to answer. And will not he who has been shown to be the wickedest be also the most miserable? And he who has tyrannized longest and most continually and truly miserable, although this may not be the opinion of men in general? Yes, he said, inevitably. And must not the tyrannical man be like the tyrannical state, and the democratic man like the democratic state, and the same of the others? Certainly. And as state is to state in virtue and happiness, so is man in relation to man? To be sure. Then comparing our original city, which was under a king, and the city, which is under a dictator, how do they stand as to virtue? They are the opposite extremes, he said, for one is the very best and the other is the very worst. There can be no mistake, I said, as to which is which, and therefore I will at once inquire whether you would arrive at a similar decision about their relative happiness and misery. And here we must not allow ourselves to be panic-stricken at the apparition of the dictator, who is only a unit and may perhaps have a few followers about him, but let us go as we ought into every corner of the city and look all about, and then we will give our opinion. A fair invitation, he replied, and I see, as everyone must, that tyranny is the most wretched form of government, and the rule of a king the happiest. And in estimating the men too, may I not fairly make a like request, that I should have a judge whose mind can enter into and see through human nature? He must not be like a child who looks at the outside and is dazzled at the pompous aspect which the tyrannical nature assumes to the beholder, but let him be one who has a clear insight. May I suppose that the judgment is given in the hearing of us all by one who is able to judge, and has dwelt in the same place with him, and been present at his daily life and known him in his family relations, where he may be seen stripped of his tragic attire, and again in the hour of public danger, he shall tell us about the happiness and misery of the dictator when compared with other men? That again, he said, is a very fair proposal. Shall I assume that we ourselves are able and experienced judges and have before now met with such a person? We shall then have someone who will answer our inquiries. By all means. Let me ask you not to forget the parallel of the individual and the state. Bearing this in mind, and glancing in turn from one to the other of them, will you tell me their respective conditions? What do you mean? Socrates asked. Beginning with the state, I replied, would you say that a city which is governed by a dictator is free or enslaved? No city, he said, can be more completely enslaved. And yet, as you see, there are freemen as well as masters in such a state. Yes, he said, I see that there are a few, but the people, speaking generally, and the best of them are miserably degraded and enslaved. Then if the man is like the state, I said, must not the same rule prevail? His soul is full of meanness and vulgarity, the best elements in him are enslaved, and there is a small ruling part, which is also the worst and maddest. Inevitably, the discussion shifts to the soul of an oppressive person, whether it resembles the soul of a freeman or a slave. The consensus is that it possesses the soul of a slave. The conversation then moves on to discuss the incapability of a state under a dictator to act voluntarily, and the troubles and remorse that plague the soul under a dictator. It is established that both the state and the soul under a dictator are poor and insatiable, always filled with fear. The focus then shifts to the misery and suffering found in such oppressive countries and individuals, with the conclusion that the oppressive person is the most miserable of all. However, a new idea is introduced, challenging this notion, and suggesting that there is someone even more miserable. The discussion then centers on the oppressive person who is also a public oppressor, highlighting their heightened misery. The argument is made that the oppressive person, despite their suffering, has not yet reached the utmost extreme of misery. An illustration is presented, comparing the condition of a tyrant to that of wealthy individuals who own many slaves. The analogy helps shed light on the tyrant's state of being, emphasizing their fear and the need to flatter their own servants. The conversation then explores a scenario where the tyrant is isolated and surrounded by enemies, further intensifying their imprisonment. The discussion concludes that the tyrant's situation is utterly miserable, and the actual oppressor is living a worse life than initially determined. The oppressive person, as the true slave, is obligated to practice flattery and servility, unable to satisfy their desires and plagued by fear and turmoil. The resemblance between the oppressive person and the country they resemble is affirmed. Furthermore, it is argued that the oppressive person becomes worse as they gain power, nurturing various vices and becoming more jealous, unfaithful, unjust, friendless, and impious. The result is that he is supremely miserable, and he makes everybody else as miserable as himself. No person with any sense will dispute your words. Come then, I said, as the general judge in theatrical contests proclaims the result, you must also decide who, in your opinion, is the happiest and who is second, and in what order the others follow. There are 5 of them in total: the royal, timocratical, oligarchical, democratic, and oppressive. The decision will be easily given, he replied. They shall come on the stage as choruses, and I must judge them in the order in which they enter, based on the criteria of virtue and vice, happiness and misery. Do we need to hire a messenger, or shall I announce that the son of Ariston, the best, has decided that the best and fairest is also the happiest? And that this person is the most noble man and king over himself? And that the worst and most unjust man is also the most miserable? And that this person, being the greatest tyrant of himself, is also the greatest tyrant of his state? You can make the proclamation yourself, he said. And shall I add, whether seen or unseen by gods and men? Let those words be added. Then this, I said, will be our first proof. And there is another, which may also have some weight. What is that? The second proof is derived from the nature of the soul. Since we have divided the individual soul, like the state, into 3 principles, this division may provide a new demonstration. What kind of demonstration? It seems to me that these 3 principles correspond to 3 pleasures, as well as 3 desires and governing powers. What do you mean? He said. Perfectly clear? There is one principle with which, as we were saying, a man learns, another with which he becomes angry. The third, having many forms, has no special name but is denoted by the general term appetitive, due to the extraordinary strength and intensity of desires for eating, drinking, and other sensual appetites, which are its main elements. It is also associated with the love of money, because such desires are generally satisfied with the help of money. that is true, he said. If we were to say that the loves and pleasures of this third part are concerned with gain, we could then fall back on a single notion. We could truly and intelligibly describe this part of the soul as loving gain or money. I agree with you. Again, isn't the passionate element wholly focused on ruling, conquering, and gaining fame? True. Suppose we call it the contentious or ambitious. Would that term be suitable? Extremely suitable. On the other hand, everyone sees that the principle of knowledge is wholly directed towards the truth, and cares less about gain or fame than either of the others. Far less. Lover of wisdom, lover of knowledge are titles which we may fittingly apply to that part of the soul? Certainly. One principle prevails in the souls of one class of men, another in others, as may happen? Yes. Then we may begin by assuming that there are three classes of men: lovers of wisdom, lovers of honor, lovers of gain? Exactly. And there are three kinds of pleasure, which are their respective objects. Very true. Now, if you examine the three classes of men and ask them in turn which of their lives is the most pleasant, each will be found praising his own and belittling that of others. The money-maker will contrast the vanity of honor or learning, if they bring no money, with the solid advantages of gold and silver. True, he said. And what will be the opinion of the lover of honor? Will he not think that the pleasure of riches is vulgar, while the pleasure of learning, if it brings no distinction, is all smoke and nonsense to him? Very true. And are we to suppose that the philosopher sets any value on other pleasures in comparison with the pleasure of knowing the truth? And in that pursuit, abiding, ever learning, not so far indeed from the heaven of pleasure? Does he not consider the other pleasures necessary, under the idea that if there were no necessity for them, he would rather not have them? There can be no doubt about that, he replied. Since, then, the pleasures of each class and the life of each are in dispute, and the question is not which life is more or less honorable, or better or worse, but which is the more pleasant or painless, how shall we know who speaks the truth? I cannot tell myself, he said. Well, but what should be the criterion? Is there anything better than experience, wisdom, and reason? There cannot be anything better, he said. Then, I said, reflect. Of the three individuals, which has the greatest experience of all the pleasures we enumerated? Does the lover of gain, in learning the nature of essential truth, have greater experience of the pleasure of knowledge than the philosopher has of the pleasure of gain? The philosopher has a great advantage. He has always known the taste of the other pleasures from his childhood upwards. But the lover of gain, in all his experience, has not necessarily tasted or, I should rather say, even if he desired, could hardly have tasted the sweetness of learning and knowing the truth. Then the lover of wisdom has a great advantage over the lover of gain, for he has a double experience? Yes, that is very true. Again, does he have a greater experience of the pleasures of honor, or does the lover of honor have a greater experience of the pleasures of wisdom? Well, all three are honored in proportion to their achievements. Both the rich man, the brave man, and the wise man have their admirers, and as they receive honor, they also have experience of the pleasures of honor. However, the delight that comes from the knowledge of true being is known only to the philosopher. So, his experience will enable him to judge better than anyone else? Far better, indeed. And he is the only one who has wisdom as well as experience. Certainly. Furthermore, the very faculty that is the instrument of judgment is not possessed by the covetous or ambitious man, but only by the philosopher. What faculty are you referring to? I am referring to reason, with whom, as we were saying, the decision ought to rest. Yes, that is correct. And reasoning is specifically the philosopher's instrument? Certainly. If wealth and gain were the criteria, then the praise or blame of the lover of gain would surely be the most trustworthy? Assuredly. Or if respect or victory or bravery were the criteria, then the judgment of the ambitious or aggressive person would be the truest? Clearly. But since experience, wisdom, and reason are the judges, The only possible conclusion, he replied, is that the pleasures approved by the lover of wisdom and reason are the truest. And so, we arrive at the result that the pleasure of the intelligent part of the soul is the most enjoyable of the three, and the person in whom this is the ruling principle has the most enjoyable life. Undoubtedly, he said, the wise man speaks with authority when he approves of his own life. And what does the judge affirm to be the next life and pleasure? Clearly, that of the soldier and lover of respect, who is closer to himself than the money-maker. Lastly, comes the lover of gain. Very true, he said. So, the just man has defeated the unjust man twice in this conflict, and now comes the third trial, which is dedicated to Olympian Zeus, the savior. A sage whisper in my ear that no pleasure except that of the wise is quite true and pure, all others are only a shadow. And surely this will prove to be the greatest and most decisive fall? Yes, the greatest. But will you explain yourself? I will elaborate on the subject, and you shall answer my questions. Proceed. Say, then, is not pleasure opposed to pain? True. And is there not a neutral state that is neither pleasure nor pain? There is. A state that is intermediate, and a sort of repose of the soul about either, that is what you mean? Yes. You remember what people say when they are sick. What do they say? They say that after all, nothing is more pleasant than health. But they never knew this to be the greatest of pleasures until they were ill. Yes, I know, he said. And when people are suffering from acute pain, you must have heard them say that there is nothing more pleasant than to get rid of their pain? I have. And there are many other cases of suffering in which the mere rest and cessation of pain, and not any positive enjoyment, is praised by them as the greatest pleasure? Yes, he said, at the time they are pleased and content to be at rest. Again, when pleasure ceases, that sort of rest or cessation will be painful. Doubtless, he said. Then the intermediate state of rest will be both pleasure and pain? So, it would seem. But can something that is neither become both? I would say not. And both pleasure and pain are motions of the soul, are they not? Yes. But that which is neither was just now shown to be rest and not motion, and in a mean between them? Yes. How, then, can we be right in supposing that the absence of pain is pleasure, or that the absence of pleasure is pain? Impossible. This, then, is only an appearance and not a reality. In other words, the rest is pleasure now and in comparison to what is painful, and painful in comparison to what is pleasant. But all these representations, when tested by the measure of true pleasure, are not real, but a sort of deception. That is the conclusion. Look at the other class of pleasures that have no preceding pains, and you will no longer suppose, as you might currently, that pleasure is only the cessation of pain, or pain of pleasure. What are these pleasures, he said, and where can I find them? There are many of them. Take, for example, the pleasures of smell, which are very great and have no preceding pains. They come in a moment, and when they depart, they leave no pain behind. Most true, he said. So, let us not be persuaded to believe that pure pleasure is the cessation of pain, or pain of pleasure. No. Still, the more numerous and intense pleasures that reach the soul through the body are generally of this sort, they are reliefs from pain. That is true. And the anticipations of future pleasures and pains are of a similar nature? Yes. Shall I give you an example of them? Let me hear. You would agree, I said, that there is in nature an upper, lower, and middle region? I would. And if a person were to go from the lower to the middle region, would he not imagine that he is going up? And he who is standing in the middle and sees where he has come from, would he not imagine that he is already in the upper region if he has never seen the true upper world? Of course, he said, how can he think otherwise? But if he were taken back again, he would imagine, and truly imagine, that he was descending? No doubt. All that would arise out of his ignorance of the true upper and middle and lower regions. Yes. Then can you wonder that persons who are inexperienced in the truth, as they have wrong ideas about many other things, should also have wrong ideas about pleasure and pain and the intermediate state, so that when they are only being drawn towards the painful they feel pain and think the pain which they experience to be real, and in like manner, when drawn away from pain to the neutral or intermediate state, they firmly believe that they have reached the goal of satiety and pleasure, they, not knowing pleasure, err in contrasting pain with the absence of pain, which is like contrasting black with gray instead of white. Can you wonder, I say, at this? No, indeed, I should be much more disposed to wonder at the opposite. Look at the matter thus: hunger, thirst, and the like, are deprivations of the bodily state? Yes. And ignorance and folly are deprivations of the soul? True. And food and wisdom are the corresponding satisfactions of either? Certainly. And is the satisfaction derived from that which has less or from that which has more existence the truer? Clearly, from that which has more. What classes of things have a greater share of pure existence in your judgment? Those of which food and drink and condiments and all kinds of sustenance are examples, or the class which contains true opinion and knowledge and mind and all the different kinds of virtue? Put the question in this way: which has a more pure being, that which is concerned with the unchanging, the immortal, and the true, and is of such a nature, and is found in such natures, or that which is concerned with and found in the changing and mortal, and is itself changing and mortal? Far purer, he replied, is the being of that which is concerned with the unchanging. And does the essence of the unchanging partake of knowledge in the same degree as of essence? Yes, of knowledge in the same degree. And of truth in the same degree? Yes. And, conversely, that which has less of truth will also have less of essence. Necessarily. Then, in general, those kinds of things which are in the service of the body have less of truth and essence than those which are in the service of the soul? Far less. And has not the body itself less of truth and essence than the soul? Yes. What is filled with more real existence, and has a more real existence, is more truly filled than that which is filled with less real existence and is less real. Of course. And if there be a pleasure in being filled with that which is according to nature, that which is more truly filled with more real being will more truly and genuinely enjoy true pleasure, whereas that which participates in less real being will be less truly and surely satisfied, and will participate in an illusory and less real pleasure? Unquestionably. Those then who know not wisdom and virtue, and are always busy with gluttony and sensuality, go down and up again as far as the mean, and in this region they move aimlessly throughout life, but they never pass into the true upper world. Thither they neither look, nor do they ever find their way, neither are they truly filled with true being, nor do they taste of pure and abiding pleasure. Like cattle, with their eyes always looking down and their heads stooping to the earth, that is, to the dining table, they fatten and feed and breed, and, in their excessive love of these delights, they kick and butt at one another with horns and hoofs which are made of iron, and they kill one another by reason of their insatiable lust. For they fill themselves with that which is not substantial, and the part of themselves which they fill is also unsubstantial and incontinent. Verily, Socrates, said Glaucon, you describe the life of the many like an oracle. Their pleasures are mixed with pains, how can they be otherwise? For they are mere shadows and pictures of the true, and are colored by contrast, which exaggerates both light and shade, and so they implant in the minds of fools insane desires of themselves, and they are fought about as Stesichorus says that the Greeks fought about the shadow of Helen at Troy in ignorance of the truth. Something of that sort must inevitably happen. And must not the like happen with the spirited or passionate element of the soul? Will not the passionate man who carries his passion into action be in the like case, whether he is envious and ambitious, or violent and contentious, or angry and discontented, if he be seeking to attain honor and victory and the satisfaction of his anger without reason or sense? Yes, he said, the same will happen with the spirited element also. Then may we not confidently assert that the lovers of money and honor, when they seek their pleasures under the guidance and in the company of reason and knowledge, and pursue after and win the pleasures which wisdom shows them, will also have the truest pleasures in the highest degree which is attainable to them, inasmuch as they follow truth, and they will have the pleasures which are natural to them, if that which is best for each one is also most natural to him? Yes, certainly, the best is the most natural. And when the whole soul follows the philosophical principle, and there is no division, the several parts are just, and do each of them their own business, and enjoy severally the best and truest pleasures of which they are capable? Exactly. But when either of the two other principles prevails, it fails in attaining its own pleasure, and compels the rest to pursue after a pleasure which is a shadow only and which is not their own. True. And the more distant they are from philosophy and reason, the stranger and more elusive will be the pleasure, right? Yes. And isn't it true that what is farthest from reason is also farthest from law and order? Clearly. And as we saw, the lustful and tyrannical desires are the farthest away, right? Yes. And the royal and orderly desires are the closest? Yes. So, the tyrant will experience the least true or natural pleasure, and the king the most? Certainly. But if that's the case, the tyrant will live most unpleasantly, and the king most pleasantly? Inevitably. Do you want to know the extent of the distance that separates them? Will you tell me? It seems that there are 3 types of pleasure, 1 genuine and 2 false. Now the transgression of the tyrant goes beyond the false. He has abandoned the realm of law and reason and taken up residence with certain slave pleasures that surround him, and the extent of his inferiority can only be expressed in a figure. What do you mean? I assume, I said, that the dictator is in the 3rd place from the oligarch, the democrat was in the middle? Yes. And if what we said before is true, he will be attached to an image of pleasure that is 3 times removed from the pleasure of the oligarch in terms of truth. He will. And the oligarch is 3rd from the royal, since we count royal and aristocratic as one? Yes, he is 3rd. So, the dictator is separated from true pleasure by a distance that is 3 times 3? Clearly. Then the shadow of tyrannical pleasure, determined by the length of the distance, will be a plane figure. Certainly. And if you raise the power and make the plane a solid, it is easy to see how vast the distance is by which the dictator is separated from the king. Yes, the mathematician will easily calculate it. Or if someone starts from the other end and measures the distance by which the king is separated from the dictator in terms of true pleasure, he will find that, when the multiplication is complete, the king lives 729 times more pleasantly, and the dictator more painfully by the same distance. What an amazing calculation! And how enormous is the distance that separates the just from the unjust in terms of pleasure and pain. Yet it is a true calculation, I said, and a number that is closely related to human life, if human beings are concerned with days and nights and months and years. 729 is nearly equal to the number of days and nights in a year. Yes, he said, human life is certainly concerned with them. So, if the good and just man is superior in pleasure to the evil and unjust man, then his superiority will be infinitely greater in terms of propriety of life and in beauty and virtue? Immeasurably greater. Well, I said, now that we have reached this point in the argument, let's go back to the words that brought us here. Didn't someone say that injustice is a gain for the perfectly unjust person who is reputed to be just? Yes, that was said. Now, having determined the power and nature of justice and injustice, let's have a little conversation with him. What should we say to him? Let's create an image of the soul, so that he can see his own words presented before his eyes. What kind of image? An ideal image of the soul, like the composite creations of ancient mythology, such as the Chimera or Scylla or Cerberus, and there are many others in which 2 or more different natures are said to merge into one. There are said to have been such unions. So now you create the form of a multitudinous, many-headed monster, with a ring of heads of all kinds of beasts, tame and wild, that he can generate and transform at will. You assume marvelous powers in the artist, but since language is more flexible than wax or any similar substance, let there be such a model as you propose. Now suppose you create a second form, like that of a lion, and a third form like that of a man, with the second smaller than the first, and the third smaller than the second. That, he said, is an easier task, and I have made them as you said. And now join them together and let the three become one. That has been accomplished. Next, shape the exterior of them into a single image, like that of a man, so that someone who is unable to look within and only sees the outer appearance, may believe the creature to be a single human being. I have done so, he said. And now, to the one who claims that it is profitable for the human being to be unjust and unprofitable to be just, let us reply that if he is right, then it is profitable for this creature to feed the multitudinous monster and strengthen the lion and the lion-like qualities, but to starve and weaken the man, who is consequently at the mercy of either of the other two, and he should not attempt to familiarize or harmonize them with one another, he should rather let them fight and bite and devour one another. Certainly, he said, that is what the supporter of injustice says. To him, the supporter of justice responds that he should always speak and act in a way that gives the man within him the most complete control over the entire human being. He should watch over the many-headed monster like a good farmer, nurturing and cultivating the gentle qualities, and preventing the wild ones from growing. He should make the lionheart his ally, and in caring for all of them, he should unite the various parts with one another and with himself. Yes, he said, that is exactly what the supporter of justice says. And so, from every perspective, whether it be for pleasure, honor, or advantage, the supporter of justice is correct and speaks the truth, while the disapprover is wrong, false, and ignorant. Yes, from every point of view. Come now, let us kindly reason with the unjust person, who is not intentionally in error. Dear sir, we will say to him, what do you think about things that are considered noble and ignoble? Isn't the noble thing that which brings the beast under the control of man, or rather, under the control of the divine within man? And the ignoble thing that which brings man under the control of the beast? He can hardly avoid saying yes, can he? Not if he respects my opinion. But if he agrees so far, we may ask him another question. Then how would a man benefit if he received gold and silver on the condition that he enslaved the noblest part of himself to the worst? Who can imagine that a man who sold his son or daughter into slavery for money, especially if he sold them to fierce and evil men, would be the winner, no matter how large the sum he received? And would anyone say that he is not a miserable wretch who heartlessly sells his own divine being to that which is most godless and detestable? Eriphyle took the necklace as the price of her husband's life, but he is taking a bribe in order to cause an even worse ruin. Yes, said Glaucon, far worse, I will vouch for that. Hasn't the reckless person been criticized in the past because in him the enormous, diverse monster is allowed to roam freely? Clearly. And aren't men blamed for arrogance and anger when the lion and serpent-like element within them grows disproportionately and gains strength? Yes. And aren't opulence and indulgence blamed because they relax and weaken this same creature and turn him into a coward? Very true. And isn't a man reproached for flattery and meanness when he subordinates the spirited animal within him to the unruly monster, and, for the sake of money, of which he can never have enough, trains him in his youth to be trampled in the mud and to go from being a lion to becoming a monkey? True, he said. And why are lowly occupations and manual arts seen as a disgrace? Only because they imply a natural weakness of the higher principle. The individual is unable to control the creatures within him, but must appease them, and his greatest study is how to flatter them. That seems to be the reason. And therefore, desiring to place him under a rule like that of the best, we say that he ought to be the servant of the best, in whom the divine rules, not, as Thrasymachus supposed, to the detriment of the servant, but because it is better for everyone to be ruled by divine wisdom dwelling within them, or, if this is impossible, then by an external authority, so that we may all, as much as possible, be under the same government as friends and equals. True, he said. And this is clearly seen as the intention of the law, which is the ally of the entire city, And it is also seen in the authority which we exercise over children, and the refusal to let them be free until we have established in them a principle similar to the constitution of a state, and by nurturing this higher element, we have established in their hearts a guardian and ruler like our own, and once this is done, they may go their own way. Yes, he said, the purpose of the law is evident. From what perspective, then, and on what grounds, can we say that a man benefits from injustice or intemperance or other vices, which will make him a worse man, even if he acquires money or power through his wickedness? From no perspective at all. What will he benefit if his injustice goes undetected and unpunished? He who goes undetected only becomes worse, whereas he who is detected and punished has the savage part of his nature silenced and civilized. The gentler element in him is set free, and his whole soul is perfected and ennobled by acquiring justice, temperance, and wisdom, more than the body ever is by receiving gifts of beauty, strength, and health, in proportion to the fact that the soul is more honorable than the body. Certainly, he said. The man of understanding will dedicate his life to this nobler purpose. And first, he will honor studies that instill these qualities in his soul and will disregard others. Clearly, he said. Next, he will regulate his bodily habits and training, and he will be far from surrendering to brutal and irrational pleasures. He will even consider health as a secondary matter. His primary goal will not be to be attractive, strong, or healthy, unless it is likely to lead to temperance. But he will always desire to temper his body in a way that preserves the harmony of his soul. Certainly, if he has true music within him. And in the pursuit of wealth, there is a principle of order and harmony that he will also observe. He will not allow himself to be blinded by the foolish applause of the world and accumulate riches to his own infinite harm. Certainly not, he said. He will examine the city that is within him and take care that no disorder occurs in it, whether it arises from excess or from deprivation, and based on this principle, he will regulate his property and gain or spend according to his means. Very true. And for the same reason, he will gladly accept and enjoy honors that he deems likely to make him a better man, but he will avoid those, whether private or public, that are likely to disrupt his life. Then, if that is his motive, he will not be a statesman. By the dog of Egypt, he will. He certainly will be a ruler in our city, the one we have founded, even though he may not be in his own homeland, unless he receives a divine calling. I understand, you mean that he will be a ruler in the ideal city that exists only in our minds, for I do not believe such a city exists anywhere on earth. In heaven, I replied, there is a blueprint of it, I believe, which those who desire may behold, and upon beholding, may organize their own lives accordingly. But whether such a city exists or will ever exist is of no consequence, for he will live in the manner of that city, having no connection with any other. I think so, he said. Summary of Chapter 9. Chapter 9 delves into the nature of the tyrannical soul and completes his exploration of the ideal city. This chapter marks the conclusion of the dialogue as Socrates and his companions return to the original question of justice in the individual and the city. The primary focus is on the character of the tyrant and the tyrannical soul. Plato explores how the pursuit of excessive desires, unchecked by reason and virtue, can lead an individual down a path of moral degradation. The tyrant, in this context, is the embodiment of a disordered soul, driven by insatiable appetites and devoid of reason or self-control. Socrates describes how the tyrannical individual becomes a slave to their desires, engaging in reckless behavior and harming others in the process. This descent into tyranny represents the ultimate corruption of the human soul, as the rational part is subjugated by the irrational appetites and emotions. As the discussion unfolds, Socrates connects the tyrannical soul to the degenerate regime of tyranny in the city. He illustrates how the tyrant's lust for power mirrors the unchecked desires of the tyrannical soul, resulting in a society marked by oppression, lawlessness, and chaos. This serves as a cautionary tale, emphasizing the importance of self-control, moderation, and the harmonious balance of the soul. It highlights the destructive consequences of allowing unchecked desires to govern one's actions, both at the individual and societal levels. In the broader context of the Republic, Chapter 9 brings the philosophical exploration full circle, returning to the central theme of justice in the individual and the city. It serves as a powerful reminder of the role of reason and virtue in maintaining a just and harmonious society while warning against the dangers of succumbing to the tyranny of one's own desires.